Hello, everyone. Today, I want to talk about the story of the Hebrews. Where did they come from? What is their ancestry? And how did they become who we know them as today? This is a topic I've covered several times before, and the areas that I'm going to deal with were actually some of the first videos that I made. So, having done even more research, I want to give this a fresh presentation. So, the Hebrews, right? The word Hebrew means they that cross over, or they that cross over the waters. It's a nomadic term. The Hebrews by nature are nomadic, meaning that we're looking at a traveling group of miscreants, right? And because of this, they've been somewhat hard to track because they're not 100% tied to any one location for too long in history. Most of their history was them traveling around, going land to land, place to place, region to region, people to people, mixing and mingling. So they actually get somewhat shrouded in some of the other cultures. Some say that they're Canaanites. Some say that they never existed. Some say that they're from here. Some say that they're from there. So I want to go over this very slowly, kind of just going at it from a biblical standpoint, an ancient standpoint, which is somewhat historical, a mythological standpoint that deals with the folklore, which is still important when dealing with genealogies, right? So I'm going to tell you where the Hebrews came from. Where are they now? I'm going to do my best. So starting off, let's deal with the figure Noah. Noah actually has one of the best openers or presentations of genealogy, and it oftentimes goes overlooked, especially like when dealing with it from a Christian or biblical standpoint. Noah's oftentimes gets overlooked in favor of the idea that everyone comes from the 12 tribes. In fact, should we all share a single ancestry, it would have come from Noah and we would have split off much, much sooner. So the story goes that Noah, and if you don't know, the story of Noah can be found in Genesis, right? Noah has three sons, right? His son Shem, Ham, and Japhet. Originally it was Cam. Translation error knocked the K off the front. Now he's a pig. But you have Noah who has his three sons, Shem, Cam, and Japhet. And it's through the lineage of Shem that you eventually get to the Hebrews. So Shem has an offspring. His son's name is Arphaxad. Arphaxad has a son. His name is Eber. Eventually, through the lineage of Eber, you get Abraham, right? So everything with and after Eber is a Hebrew. And there's many different branches of the Hebraic. Usually when you think of the Hebraic, you're thinking about Israelite culture, or specifically Judean culture. And even in a more modern sense, you're not actually even thinking about the actual bloodline of the Hebrews. You're thinking about the religion of the Central Europeans that we currently have right now. It gives a different presentation when you look at it culturally, that it's an entire family, right? So Ishmael and Isaac are both Hebrews. They're Hebrews, not Jewish, right? They're not Judeans. The closest you can get to Judah would happen after Israel, because Judah is one of the sons of Israel. You get the point that no one before Judah can be considered a Jew, even by technicality. No one before Eber can really be considered Hebrew. They're named after him. Right. So, in fact, for those of you interested, not only do I teach on the significance and the spiritual aspects of the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Israel, but also the 12 sons and the 12 tribes of Ishmael. That's something that I already have on Patreon for those of you interested. But so that's important to look at, because oftentimes the name of a people comes from the forefather or foremother, the patriarch or the matriarch of a civilization. Names are one of the common ways that we share lineage, right? So when we're dealing with the lineage of Shem, one of Noah's sons, that's the only group in which the Hebrews come from, right? Genetically. Now, religiously or culturally, because they're nomadic, they borrowed from a lot of people, right? I didn't include them on this chart, but it's under the lineage of Chem that you get Canaan and Mizraim, which is Egypt. The Hebrews were actually heavily connected to them culturally and religiously. In fact, there is no Hebrew culture without Egyptian culture. There is no Hebrew religion without Egyptian spirituality. Same with the Canaanites. The Hebrews borrowed from everyone that they interacted with. Now, here's something fun. Let's stick with Noah for just a moment. The reason why it's important to recognize who these people are and where they're at what point is because it gives you a different frame of reference when dealing with them, and it gives you a better way to understand them at their time period. If you go into the Bible assuming everything in it is Hebrew, you miss it. And yes, I love the Hebraic, I embrace the Hebraic, but the Hebraic is not the oldest. It's actually one of the newest in comparison to the ancient world. It's highly beneficial, but it's not the oldest, nor is it the source of really anything, right? Since everything before Eber isn't Hebrew, that means that Shem, Ham, Japhet, and Noah were not Hebrews, right? Everyone before them, this means Enoch, not a Hebrew. Noah, not a Hebrew. Adam and Eve, not Hebrews. Cain and Abel, not Hebrews. Seth, not Hebrews. But the Bible does tell you what region these early people are dealing with, and it's Mesopotamia. These are all Mesopotamian people. How do I know this? Well, the Bible actually tells you the region, right? In placing the Garden of Eden, where they present that humanity came out of, or at least a strand of humanity came out of, depending on your beliefs, it tells you that they were between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. This is Mesopotamia. So it's dealing dominantly with the people of Mesopotamia and their exploits and their journeys spreading out from that point. The Bible pretty much paints itself inside out. You start from the delta of the Tigris and Euphrates River, and it goes out from there, eventually populating the rest of the world. And that's actually what happens with Noah and his sons. When they repopulate the earth, they're each given plots of land and are presented as the forefathers of different civilizations and different people groups. In fact, if you read the Perky de Rabbi Eleazar, chapter 24, it's a Jewish text, it's a Hebrew text, and it actually talks about how Noah, it talks about the appearances of them, right? It mentions that Shem and Kim were both dark-skinned and that Japhet was unmelanated. It's for this reason that Japhet is actually believed to be the forefather of what we now consider white people, the Europeans. So he would be the forefather of the Greeks and the Romans and so on and so forth, right? You have Cam, like I said, Egypt, Canaan, and then Shem, well, the Hebrews, the Sumerians to an extent. Now, the specific branch of Mesopotamian gets a little tricky. Now, and I'll be honest, I'm not 100% sure which specific group or which specific faction of Mesopotamian that they were a part of, dealing with Noah and his people, or let's just say the branch between Noah and Adam. I'm not 100% sure, but I lean more towards believing that they are Scythians. Scythians often described as being the sons of Set, and that's actually the genealogy that you follow in the Old Testament that eventually leads to Yeshua. It's the lineage of Set. Not just that, but culturally, they're very similar. Nomadic pastoral people moving through the region, interacting heavily with the Canaanites and the Egyptians. I'm like, this sounds like the Hebrews, because that's what they did. Again, dealing with Hebraic culture is nomadic. And that's really what you're getting throughout the entire Old Testament is a story of these people. And we're looking at it from their lens, their side of their story, traveling place to place, land to land over generations. And you have to understand a few things about their culture. For one, writing was considered taboo for most of it. So they weren't writing. They shared everything through oral tradition. So they would tell stories. Well, guess what? When you're mixing and you're mingling and you're traveling as much as they are as a way of life, well, they're assimilating the stories and the cultures from everywhere that they're around. Nothing wrong with that. In fact, the Hebrews had no problem paying homage to where they were getting their inspirations from. And they did this mainly through names, right? You have the sons of Israel, named after deities from different traditions. You have Asher, named after Asher, the Semitic deity, right? You have some believe that Judah, which would be Yehuda, is actually named after Jehudi, the Kemetic deity, right? And these aren't distant cultures. These aren't even enemy cultures. These are cultures that the Hebrews, for the most part, got along with and spent a lot of time with. So it's not just that, oh, they got this after they were captive, after they lost the fight. Sometimes, yeah, but no, this was stuff that was always part of their culture. They assimilated as they went. This is why certain months in the Hebrew calendar are named after Sumerian deities or Mesopotamian deities. For example, you have Tammuz, named after Tammuz. The Lord who resurrects in the springtime. The spring represents his rebirth. Fall or winter represents his death. So it's death and rebirth over and over again. There's also a pastoral deity. Sounds a little familiar, right? The Hebrews didn't actually cover the fact that they were learning from other cultures. In fact, this has also been one of my pet peeves is that some people, when embracing the Hebraic, treat the Hebraic as if it's the only stream that the divine ever interacted with humanity through, or that it's the plumb line by which all truth flows from, and that couldn't be further from the truth. The Hebrews were students of everyone. They weren't teachers of everyone. They mastered a lot. They activated a lot. They walked in a lot because they learned from a lot of people in a lot of places. They learned how to do a lot. There is no Hebrew alphabet without the Canaanites, without the Egyptians or the Kemites, without the Cushites, without the people of the Ugaritic pantheon, right? There is no Hebraic without these other civilizations, without the Persians, without the Assyrians. You don't have the Hebraic because they learned from all of them. So let's talk about the flood story, right? The flood story is one of the most fascinating, at least for me, areas of history, human literature, mythology. And I believe that folklore is one of the areas that shows connecting points. In the biblical narrative, as we have it in modern times in Genesis, the story goes that Noah was told by God that there was a flood that was coming that was going to wipe out humanity, and he was instructed to build this ark. And he gets on the ark with some of his family, a bunch of animals. They weather the storm, they come out, and they repopulate the world. Well, the story as you have it in Genesis is not the oldest version of that story. The oldest version of that story actually comes from two places, and I'm undecided on which one is older because they're both pre-flood civilizations, and I'd rather not get into which one is older when you're getting into the several thousands of years old range. At that point, you're both old. I love you both, right? And that's actually the Sumerians and the Hindus. They have the exact same story. The difference is that they weren't monotheistic, at least in their presentation. So where the English translation of the Bible currently has one God that's doing the destruction and the protecting of humanity, it's two separate gods. You have one God that is upset with humanity, so he says, I'm going to wipe you all out. The Sumerians call him Enlil. The Hindus call him Shiva, but in their story, they don't actually mention who's doing the destruction, that being the Hindu narrative. Just that a destruction is coming. And the God that's doing the salvation of humanity, well, the Sumerians, they call him Enki or Ea. And in the Hindu tradition, they call him Vishnu, savior of humanity. Right? So what happens is one God sends a flood to destroy humanity. The other rescues humanity from that very flood. That's a major part, and that's true in most ancient cultures. One God does the destructing, the other does the saving. In the Hindu narrative, they speak to a king whose name was Manu. In the Sumerian narrative, well, he has a few different names, right? You have Zisudra, you have Atrahasis, you have Utnapishtim. In the Persian narrative, they call him King Yima, right? It's still talking about the same figure from around the same place. Now, there's an interesting point within, I believe it was the Epic of Atrahasis where I read it. Correct me if I'm wrong, other scholars, but there's a moment where it's talking about after the flood, there's a transition, right? And they go about this transition differently. So in some cases, the storm shelter that they're in gets swept away in the flood anyway, but they're protected on the inside, but they end up somewhere else. In some cases, they're on a boat and they just sail somewhere off and the water eventually settles. But the important thing that I'm getting at is there comes a point where they transition away and there are no more people. And the king that's leading the charge, whether you want to call him Noah or Atrahasis or Manu, he says in grief that he misses his black-faced people. And that's the term being used. And funny enough, I found that in both the Hindu tradition and in the Mesopotamian traditions, they referred to themselves around this time period as dark-faced. Now, specifically in the Hindu tradition, the dark-faced people would be the Dravidians. The Sumerians called themselves dark-faced. Now, this isn't new language, right? This is for this reason that Ethiopia got its name. The Greeks went over there, saw some people with dark skin, and named them Ethiopos. Ethiopos means the burnt-faced people, meaning you so black, you burnt, right? That's what they're talking about. So not only are they talking about a melanated people, but dark enough for them to mention them being black in comparison, right? Because there's shades of melanation. You have your light skins, your brown skins, red skins, and then blackety black, blue black, right? Right? There's shades of this. So in dealing with the Mesopotamians and the Hindus or the Dravidians, they felt the need to express the fact that the people that they were dealing with were really, really dark. And the leader of the charge missed them. He said, I miss my people. I haven't seen them. Right. This again goes back to the Perky de Rabbi Eleazar. It mentions that the Hebrews and the that the Shemites and the Kemites are both very dark people. It just mentions that Shem, because this is a Hebrew book, it mentions that he's comely, say he's a little handsome and dark, calls him dark and comely, calls Ham dark, and calls Japhet white. That's Hebrew literature, right? Now, not only are the stories almost identical, but they express the same beats, the same narratives, even down to the people groups that they're dealing with. I found it interesting that they both reference their home of origin of being the home of very dark-skinned people. So it's for this reason, I don't know which one is older, right? They're both pre-flood. They're both ancient, first civilizations ever, right? I don't know which one's older. And I'm not going to try. I lean towards saying that the Mesopotamians are older just because their stories go back further, right? Manu is traditionally considered the first man in the Hindu tradition, and it's for that reason I'd put him a bit further back, because they're claiming that they started after the flood, or more so that there was a civilization that existed before the flood, but Manu is presented as their first person. They're a major patriarchal figure, and that could be for several reasons. Just because everyone after him kind of plays into the role. But this is pretty much my current conclusion concerning the Hebrews, right? Is that they come from Mesopotamia in India, the Indus Valley and the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, nomadic peoples from both. So there's a moment, or let's just say a series of moments, where Mesopotamia branches off into a bunch of nomadic tribes. So everything that came out of the Semitic regions isn't a Hebrew, right? As in, they're not necessarily connected to the people we now know as the Hebrews, right? Nomadic, but different region or different genealogies, right? And there being several different groups that branched off from Mesopotamia that were nomadic, even when it comes down to the worship of Yahweh. The Hebrews or the Israelites weren't the first people to worship Yahweh. One of the earliest groups that I've been able to find is a group called the Shasu, which were recognized by the Egyptians, right? They were called the Shasu of Yahweh by the Egyptians. And this was before interactions with the Israelites. Again, right? And just again, talking about the connection. So this is their genealogy. This is the genealogy that I'm sold on. Mesopotamian and Hindu. Now let's talk more about this, right? Not only, so this is their genealogy. Culturally, they learned from the Canaanites and the Egyptians more dominantly. So you have Mesopotamian Hindus that learned from the Egyptians and the Canaanites and adopted their practices, who were eventually conquered by the Romans and almost wiped out. Where do we, okay, I'll leave that alone. I'll come back to where they are now, right? So you have folklore as an example. You have the religious. Let's deal with the Hindu connection. So remember I said that everything after Eber is a Hebrew, right? And because of people's religious biases, they likely clutched their pearls when I said that the Hindus had any connection to the Hebrews, right? On a cultural level, if you actually examine the spiritual practices and the way of life they're set up, it's kind of obvious that they're connected in some way. My personal belief is that the mixture happened somewhere around the time of Arphaxad, but before Eber. That's my guess. It's just because that's around the time that I'm actually able to study and see a shift, right? I don't see a lot of Hindu connection in Mesopotamia all too much, but I do see it once we get deep into the Hebrew culture. So I assume that the merger of cultures happened somewhere around the time of Arphaxad, because he's right in the middle. That's my logic. That's my reasoning. If you can think of a better time, hey, I'm all ears, right? Now, when examining Hebrew culture, and I've been studying the Hebraic for almost a decade, right? There's certain things that the Hebrews do that are kind of one-to-one to Hindu culture. For one, being their breath work. Not just that they have breath work, but the kind of breath work that they do is exactly the same thing as what the Hindus call pranayama. Not only that, but Yahweh and Shiva are the same deity, down to their usage in their respective pantheons. Again, the ancient world was a lot more polytheistic and was honest about its polytheism, even though you had individual factions within their cosmology which clung to one deity over another. But Yahweh and Shiva, as far as Hindu and Canaanite mythology, play pretty much the same role as the destroyer. In fact, the name Yahweh doesn't only mean the breath, but it also means the raider, the horror, the desolation, or other translations of the name Yahweh. So the Hebrews are specifically, if we're pulling from their Hindu lineage, Shivites, and it's specifically the ways of Shiva that you recognize in Hindu culture. Not just that, but more proof to the influence of the Hindus in their culture comes down again to those naming schemes. Remember, I mentioned earlier that even down to the time of the Israelites, they had no problem paying homage to where they came from or where they were gaining influence from, especially through names, name of their months, name of their holidays, names of their children, right? Well, look no further than Abraham and Sarah, who are named after the mother and father god of the Hindu pantheon, Brahma and Saraswati, right? That's kind of what we do even today. There's so many people in Mexico named Jesus and Maria because Jesus and Mary are very revered in that culture because of how dominant Catholicism is. Yeah, that's a pretty big one when you put it in perspective, that down to the wire, they're still naming themselves after the deities of their ancestors. Not only that are they named similar, but their names mean the same thing and are used in a similar fashion that we use names today, right? So in the Hindu tradition that bleeds into the Hebrew tradition, you see it a lot. The way that they use music, the way that they use dance, the specific dances that they do, this is the specific music that they play, the specific music, spiritual exercises, specifically with the breath work. Not only this, but remember, everything after Eber is a Hebrew. Well, when you start to study Islam through the branch of Ishmael, well, you kind of recognize very quickly how heavily inspired the Muslims are, the people of Islam are, by the Hindus. In fact, they have specifically Shiva lingam built into their temples. They'll have repurposed Hindu temples as their mosques. They'll still participate in Hindu rituals in dedication to Allah, which is the same as Yahweh, which is the same as Shiva, and they're not really hiding it. This is why they, for the most part, get along, is that they're worshiping the same God through different ancestral pathways, but same spirit overall. So there's been multiple discoveries. Some of the oldest Islamic temples, they dig deep into them and find more Hindu relics, but specifically Shiva-related relics. Again, Shiva Lingam, they are connected. So considering that not only is it in Israelite culture, but it's also in Ishmaelite culture, right? And it's even as blatant as Abraham and his sister being named after the mother and father god of the Hindu pantheon. There is some connection there. Well, what about Egypt, right? I've mentioned Egypt. I've mentioned the Canaanites. Well, I've often said that when dealing with the Bible is a compilation of Mesopotamian, Kemetic, Hebrew, Canaanite, stories, scriptures, and literature, all haphazardly put together by the Romans. Guess what? For the most part in the Bible, the stuff that is not Hebrew is Egyptian. You don't have anything in the Bible, right? You don't have any of the expertise. You don't have the languages. You don't have the Hebrew languages. You don't have the Hebrew mastery. You don't have Yeshua. You don't have the tribes without Egypt, right? Even in the book of Hebrews, they actually commend Moses for learning the ways of the Egyptians. Moses being brought up in Pharaoh's house, he didn't learn anything bad. In fact, if what he learned was bad, Yahweh, who was very adamant about hating witches and witchcraft, would have killed Moses instead of worked with him. Not only did he work with him, but he empowered him to do what he already knew how to do because of what he learned from the Egyptians, just to a greater magnitude. He increased the magnitude of his skillfulness instead of rebuking him and saying, no, we don't follow those ways anymore. This is what I want you to do. So not only that, right, you have Moses. First 80 or so years of his life, he's spending in Kemetic Cushite culture. In fact, the Legends of the Jews talks about him ruling in Cush for a period of time. So he's one of the few who actually went through the archetype of king, priest, and prophet at different stages of their life, fully embodying all three. But 80 of those years was in Kemetic Cushite culture. Moses implemented that at every step of the way. Guess what? Moses did not speak Hebrew. That's why Aaron was his translator. Moses spoke Meduneter, which you currently call hieroglyphics. So it's for this reason that if someone claims to have found the original tablets and they're written in Hebrew, they're fake. Moses didn't speak nor write Hebrew. He was Hebrew by bloodline, Kemetic and Cushite by culture. He was raised in the house of the Pharaoh as one of the sons, right? So even for this reason, it says that he had a stammering tongue. Some people take that to mean that he had a stuttering problem or a speech impediment. No, if you actually hear Meduneter spoken, it's a stammering tongue. It's a stammering language. So you have all the different practices of Moses not only being tolerated, but embraced. A lot of Hebrew culture comes from Moses, and Moses, the bulk of his culture was Egyptian. The language of the Hebrews, the Hebrew alphabet, the earliest version being Paleo-Hebrew, the ancient Hebrew variant, very, and let's just say almost identical to Meduneter, which is the Egyptian hieroglyphics, right? Almost identical. Not just down to the shapes, but to the meanings of what they represent. But not just that, you also see references with other surrounding areas. You see it in the Canaanite language. You see it in the Assyrian language. You see it in the Ugaritic language. You see it in the Sumerian language, cuneiform. You see a lot of these references where you kind of have to be dense to not recognize the connections. The Hebrews, again, were very open about themselves learning from all these different cultures. So I've shared with you where the Hebrews came from. Again, I believe my conclusion is that they are a connection of Mesopotamian and Hindu over a period of time, and that they learned from the Egyptians and the Canaanites and pretty much everyone else that they spent time with. But where are they now? So in the same way that I use folklore as a medium to show the connection between those different cultures, I'll use it again. And I'll tell you a story. So there once was a story of a people fleeing captivity and fleeing famine. And so they prayed to God and they followed this magical pillar through the wilderness, eventually arriving at their promised land. This is not the story of the Israelites. This is the story of the Choctaw and Chickasaw. If you are Choctaw or Chickasaw, you are Hebrew, as in actual Hebrew. And my conclusion comes from their folklore. If you don't believe folklore is enough, fine, I do. Because in every other instance of human civilization, folklore is valid as a means of showing connection between cultures. Right? That's actually the story. One group went north, the other stayed south, but still the same story that you get in Exodus, leaving a land of famine, of desolation, following a magical pillar. Remember, the Bible says they followed a pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night, and they eventually made it to their promised land. That's the same as the magic pillar that the Choctaw and Chickasaw followed. So at the very least, if you have actually Choctaw and Chickasaw in your family, you have Hebrew in your family. And by default, you have Hindu and Mesopotamian in your family. Now, I'll tell you this. It's for this reason that people, and I've talked to a lot of leaders, so I'm telling their business without telling y'all who I'm talking about, right? It's for this reason, just going back to the Hindu thing, that so many leaders, once they start dealing heavily in the Hebraic, they feel an inclination towards yoga. I'm not saying yoga is right or wrong. I'm just talking about where the inclination comes from. And it's because the Hebrews get a dominant part of their spirituality from the Hindus, and specifically from Shiva, as they are Shivites. So, all right, y'all. That's it. That's it for this session. I've shared pretty much everything that I wanted to share for this. I would recommend read the flood stories yourself. Go back in Genesis, read the story of Noah, read the story of Manu in the Hindu tradition, read the story of Atrahasis, of Zasudra, of Utnapishtim. Go back and read those stories for yourself. See if you see what I see. See if you disagree with me, but do your research. Read these texts yourself. Go back and look at Legends of the Jews. Read through the Old Testament if you have not ever before. Track the narrative. Right? Look at ancient Hebrew and compare it to the other ancient languages of the people that they were connecting to, and you'll actually watch it evolve over time. At its earliest stages, it looks closest to Medu Neter because Moses spoke Medu Neter. That was his dominant language. And the further they get away from Moses, the more it starts to look like the other regions that they're dealing with. Go and read the folklore. Go and read the stories, right? What's not Egyptian, what's not Hebrew dominantly. Guess what? A large portion of the Bible is Canaanite. In fact, the book of Job is not a Hebrew book. It's a Canaanite book. It's a Canaanite story. It's Canaanite cosmology. Even with him dealing with the divine council, going up and having meetings, that's a Canaanite or Ugaritic presentation, not a Hebrew or an Israelite presentation. It's not even Egyptian. So y'all, at the very least, right? Let me know if you agree with me. Let me know if you disagree with me. Let me know why. But at the very least, go study this stuff. I find it fascinating. Again, if you're interested in checking out, as I said before, I've talked about the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Israel. I've written about it in my book, Fullness Guide to Sonship and Mysticism, talking about their benefits, the blessings, the dimensions that they carry that you can walk in Christhood. But there's also another facet of that, being the 12 sons of Ishmael, which go completely overlooked, and there's more power in there too. So if that's also a topic that you're interested in, check it out. I've already done that session on Patreon, as well as talking more about the connection of these ancient worlds, these ancient civilizations, where they mix, where they mingle, where they disagree, where they influence. I think it's fascinating. So if you're also fascinated, join the Patreon. Again, everything about me is on my website, caveofmystery.org. You can find the Patreon there. Get signed up. It's only $10 a month. Until next time, y'all be blessed. Later.